Today's edition of MacVoices is brought to you by Blue Apron. Blue Apron delivers fresh ingredients and recipes to your door so you can cook something new and interesting tonight. Check out this week's menu and get your first 3 meals free with free shipping by visiting blueapron.com/MacVoices. Blue Apron, a better way to cook. And by Smile, the makers of world-class software like PDF Pen for Mac, PDF Pen Pro for Mac, PDF Pen for iPhone and iPad, PDF Pen Scan Plus for iPhone and iPad, Text Expander for Mac, and Text Expander for iPhone and iPad. Learn more about all their great products at smilesoftware.com. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, one of Apple's pieces of software that seems to get a lot of updates and has been getting a lot of updates is iTunes. And that's why it's always great to check in with Kirk McElhearn, the author of Take Control of iTunes, to see what is new. This is the second edition of the book, Kirk, and I'm first of all, I'm great to have you as always. Sorry. kind of skipped over that part.
It's always fun to talk to you.
Yeah, this is interesting. And this is the second edition of Take Control of iTunes 12. But
right.
It seems like you and I have talked a lot about iTunes because we keep talking about the updates to the book because there are lots of updates to iTunes. So where do we stand right now with iTunes? How caught up are we, and what's different about this since it is a revision 2 book?
Yeah, so this book was first born under iTunes 10, and that goes back, 4 years, 4.5, 5 years, something like that. So there was an iTunes 10 edition with updates, an iTunes 11 edition with updates. iTunes 12 was released in June of 2015, so just over a year and a half ago, which coincided with the release of Apple Music. Since then, there has been iTunes 12.1, 12.2, et cetera, and iTunes 12.5, which was the last major release, came out, I believe, in October. We started working on the book, and then Apple dropped an iTunes 12.5.1, and then they dropped to 12.5.2, and then one thing led to another, and we got a little bit late, and so the book is up to date for today's version of iTunes, which is 12.5.5. There have actually been a fair number of minor and less minor changes to iTunes since the initial 12.5 release. Interface changes, terminology changes, things moving around, menu items, contextual menus, and all that. Okay, so a lot of things here.
You've always been kind of an outspoken critic of iTunes, good and bad, and I mean that in the best possible way because sometimes it needs it. Sometimes we've talked about how iTunes gets a little better. Sometimes we've talked about how iTunes gets a little worse. Yeah. Where is it now with these recent additions? Are we getting to something you're happy with or can live with, or is it still just a bit of a mess?
I would say for the majority of iTunes, this is an improvement over the initial iTunes 12 release. I think what happened when iTunes 12 came out is they really made an awful lot of changes, and they didn't put as much thought into it as one would expect. And I think in my review for Macworld, I said something to the effect that it looks like iTunes design is managed by the marketing department and not by the human interface department, because of the way that they integrate the store and Apple Music and the cloud purchases and all that. Since the first version of iTunes 12, they've really made a lot of progress. They've revamped Apple Music to make it a lot easier to use. They've fixed a lot of interface issues. They've simplified a number of things. They've moved some things, which is annoying, and there are a couple of features that aren't working correctly or don't work at all or have been forgotten. But I'd say that we're in a better place today than we were when the first version of iTunes 12 came out.
Okay, that's always encouraging. The thing that bothers me the most about all these revisions that we've seen is the moving around of stuff. Because at some point, stop moving it. Okay, it may not be perfect, but at least I'll know where to find it. And when I have to constantly go and re-look for certain features and controls, that's kind of a failure, I think, on somebody's part. I'm not quite sure whose.
Well, on the one hand, you want things to be organized in a logical manner. And if you've slapdash added a feature someplace and you realize, both from your own experience and from your user's experience, that it's not in the right place, then you do want to move it. The biggest problem, and every time we talk about iTunes, the word bloat comes up, and I don't think that iTunes is bloated as such. The description, the way you define software bloat doesn't really work with iTunes. It does a lot. It's supposed to do a lot. But the problem is there are a lot of discrete features. There are an awful lot of things to do. And frankly, if I were to come into this today to write a book from scratch right now, it would take me an awful long time. I mean, the latest edition of this book is 260 pages. I think the iTunes 10 version was maybe 100 pages less. And it's not that we've just added pages just to increase the page count. It's not. It's that there are more features and more things to talk about. So, on the one hand, you want to organize things in a certain way. On another hand, you figure out there's a better way to do it. It's always the balance in software between, when you're adding new features. Do you add them? Do you move them? Do you change them? Do you remove them? I probably one of the problems with iTunes is that they're loath to remove features. They tend to just add things more and clutter things. Menus get cluttered, for instance. Contextual menus are getting longer and longer. But again, it's just part and parcel of an app that does an awful lot of things.
Yeah, I think that's something that some of the critics do lose sight of. And there's the talk of this should be broken off into audio apps and video apps and this app and that app. And I'm not sure that I'm a proponent of that. There's things that would certainly make it easier. But at the same time, I kind of like having one place to go, and I can control so much of my media experience, assuming that I buy my music through iTunes and listen to Apple Music and all that.
Well, you don't need to buy your music through iTunes. You can rip your CDs and download music from any place else. When confronted with that argument, I give two reasons why it shouldn't be split. Because people say, okay, it would be better if there was just one tool for syncing and then one tool for music and one tool for videos and one tool for managing apps and one tool for radio and one tool. And, that's a lot of apps that you've got to open. So that's reason one. Reason two, it just comes down to one word, and that's Windows. There are probably 10 times as many Windows users using iTunes as Mac users. And the last thing you want is to start, raining down on Windows users with a dozen apps that they need to download. It would just be a mistake. And probably just from an organizational point of view, I don't know anything about Windows development, but I can imagine it would pose a certain number of problems. There are ways to make a minimal version of iTunes. You can just turn off the features you don't want. You can turn off the store. You can turn off Apple Music. You can hide all the media kinds that you don't want to use. In fact, it's good that you make me think of this. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article on my blog explaining how to make a minimal iTunes music player, how to hide everything. And that's out of date. So when we finish recording, I'll write that article and I'll send you a link and you can include it in the show notes. So I will basically show users, if you turn off all these things here, you can just play your music.
Thank you. That'll be a very interesting article, because I admit I'm sitting here thinking, okay, what features don't I use? It would be nice if I could turn them off so they just sort of disappear.
Well, I'll show. You'll see screenshots how it looks between the normal iTunes and the minimal iTunes, and it's quite striking. I've long thought that Apple should, and it's hard to imagine a situation where this works. I don't think this is an ideal situation, but they should have a little switch in iTunes, simple and advanced, that for average users with simple uses, you only see certain features, and if you're an advanced user, you see other features. Most users don't ever tag their files. They don't rip CDs. They don't need all of the features that everyone does. They don't need to view all the columns. They don't need to view all the things in the contextual menu. But when you make an app and you've got simple and advanced, and users may forget which is the simple and which is the advanced, it gets confusing. I think back to Microsoft Word on Windows. This goes back to 97-ish, where when you installed it, it didn't install all of the software. So sometimes you would click a menu and select a menu command, and it would say, well, this wasn't installed yet. Insert the CD to install this feature. And that was just endlessly frustrating.
This edition of MacVoices is sponsored by Smile, the makers of world-class software for the Mac and iOS. Find out about their amazing utilities that can make you more productive at smilesoftware.com. I've been using that opening more or less for some time now. Just when I had it down, Smile goes and changes something. Now, my absolute favorite productivity app for the Mac, Text Expander, is available for Windows too. Text Expander for Windows version 1 is now out from Smile and brings all the productivity goodness to that other platform. Wait, this is a Mac Focus podcast. Why am I telling you about Text Expander for Windows? Several good reasons. First, whether we like it or not, many of us have to use Windows for one reason or another at the office or for something at home. Sitting down to a Mac that doesn't have Text Expander installed feels like a big piece of the operating system is missing. Sitting down to a Windows PC felt even worse, until now. With Text Expander for Windows, not only do I have the text expansion I want, love, and depend on, but it even goes farther. As long as you have matching versions of Text Expander, you can sync and share your snippets between platforms. Having common snippets for your Mac, your iPhone, your iPad, and now your Windows machine means that you're more productive anywhere and everywhere. A few snippets can save you hundreds of keystrokes and precious time each day. Not sure just how useful Text Expander can be? Text Expander monitors your keystrokes, notices that you repeat certain words or phrases regularly, and suggests that you use a snippet instead. Text Expander is the one utility I use every single time I use my Mac, multiple times every hour. It's one of the best values in productivity software going, and you can try it for free. Just visit smilesoftware.com and download their free trial of Text Expander and find out what it can do for you. Text Expander for Mac is just the start. Once you get up to speed, check out Text Expander for iPhone and iPad next. And if you have a Windows machine, you definitely need to check out Text Expander for Windows. You can do it all at smilesoftware.com. Thanks to Smile for their terrific products and for being the longest-running sponsor of MacVoices. You bring up Windows, and I have to absolutely admit that that's not something that really goes into my thinking when I fire up iTunes and start having this internal debate with myself of should this be split off, should that be split off. Interesting that they did make the choice, at least on the Mac side. I don't know if there's a podcast app from Apple on the Windows side, but they broke podcast out separately. I didn't think there was.
No, not on the Mac. On iOS they did.
Yeah,
podcasts are still in iTunes.
It's
books that they took out. It's ebooks.
That's right. It's books, and okay, and especially since I personally have gotten away from listening to podcasts on my Mac and tend to just do it now on my iDevices. I forget that that's a separate app.
Yeah,
and
but they did split out the iBooks app, and that's a bit strange because you can still get to ebooks in the iTunes store from iTunes. You don't need to do that in the iBooks app. The only thing the iBooks app does for you is it lets you read the books on your Mac. Now, it's true that I guess the logic is they didn't want to roll that reading feature into iTunes. But frankly, how different is that than playing a video in iTunes? It opens in a new window. However, when you look at Windows, there is no iBooks app, so you still keep your ebooks in your iTunes library. However, I'm not sure if you can read them in iTunes on Windows. I have a cheap Windows laptop that I bought for £120, and I shall check it out later and see if you can read an ebook in iTunes.
Another article coming. So we kind of zoomed out to the 30,000-foot level. Let's zoom back in and talk about where iTunes stands now. What changes are documented in the book, and what things should we really be aware of, maybe as the basic user and the advanced user both?
Yeah. So in my book, there are 2 pages of what's new in iTunes 12.5, and we split this to interface changes and new features. So the interface changes start with Apple Music. The Apple Music refresh is such that it's more legible, it's easier to navigate. On the other hand, they use these really big album artwork, which is just surprising. It takes up a lot of space. And I don't think that's ideal, but I think the navigation, I was very critical of Apple Music navigation in the first version, but they've made this a lot better. Now, they did this, of course, this is not necessary. This isn't related to iTunes as such. Remember, all the Apple Music stuff is done for iTunes and iOS at the same time. It's like a responsive website. So for listeners who don't know what that means, when you look at a website on a desktop computer in a web browser, it looks one way. You look at the same site on an iPhone or an iPad, it looks different. Everything's smaller. It's designed for a smaller display. So Apple Music is just basically web pages. And the refresh that they've done makes it a lot more coherent between the desktop and iOS devices. And it's clearer, it's cleaner. An interesting feature that they added, and I believe this was 12.2.2 or 3. You're familiar with the sidebar in the iTunes window. And a couple of years ago, I believe iTunes 11, they got rid of the sidebar, and people were like, wow, we can't live like this. And so fortunately, they brought it back. But they've added an interesting feature now that if you hide the sidebar, and you do this from the View menu, you choose View, Hide Sidebar, those little navigation buttons at the center of iTunes, one of them says Library, and that Library button turns into a pop-up menu. So you can actually access anything that is in your sidebar if your sidebar is not visible from that button. And this is really practical. If you don't want the sidebar, you still have access to the same things.
Okay, I haven't tried that because I'm very much a sidebar guy.
Yeah, me too. We're so used to it in so many apps. I've got Mail is open behind the Skype window here. It's got a sidebar. iTunes has a sidebar. Photos has a sidebar. Evernote. A sidebar is an extraordinary interface element. But if you're on a small display, that sidebar gets in the way. I've got a 12-inch MacBook on my desk. iTunes doesn't display a whole lot in a 12-inch display.
Yeah,
so that's useful. They've simplified. This is a minor issue, but there's a store pane in the preferences, and they've taken out all of the download settings and put them in a downloads preference pane. Now, when Apple does something like this, it's probably a big decision to create a new preference pane in any app, because that's instant complexity when there's an extra icon in the toolbar when you look in preferences. There's a lot of logic to this, but this makes me also think that this is preemptive, that they're going to be adding something more in that preference pane in the future. We keep talking about streaming videos that Apple's going to be doing and things like that. So I have a feeling this downloads preference pane is preparation for something that we'll see later. So the little icons in the sidebar for your playlist, right? They're like little the standard playlist icon's a series of lines. It's not a very obvious icon. They've added little badges on these icons to show what kind of media they contain. So if it's a music playlist, it's got a music note. If it's a video playlist, it's got like a 35 millimeter film frame on it, etc. And this is really good if you have a lot of playlists. You can spot them at a glance to see what kind of media they are. I would be all in favor of them bringing back color in the sidebar. Remember how much nicer that was when you had all these different colors to indicate things, and your eye is naturally drawn to a color. You're thinking, I want to look for this. It's that color. There it is. Whereas now we still have this sort of monochromatic display with these little badges that help, but they're not, extraordinary.
Yeah, I wish they would do that both in iTunes, but also in the Finder. I miss the colored icons.
In the Finder, in Mail, everywhere.
Yeah.
I think it's a shame. I think there is a design logic to attenuating colors, but unfortunately, the usability doesn't go along with it. I really miss it. I really do. There are some other interesting interface features. You can quickly edit the name of an album or an artist when you're in Albums View. So Albums View is the one where you see the album artwork and the artist and the album below it, right? It's a type of a grid view. So if you click on the album name and hold your cursor just for a second, it'll highlight so you can change the name. This is really good because the only other way to change tags like this is to select something and press Command-I and go into this info window, which can be daunting for some people. So if you simply want to change an album or artist name, you can do this in Albums View very quickly. Again, most people don't do this. The only time I change things like that is when I add music or when I rip a CD, and I'm not going to change an album name or an artist name. What I'm thinking here is they do this because people get music from different places, if you know what I mean. And they might see that, this one's the Allman Brothers and this one's Allman Brothers without the, and they want to make it coherent. So it'd be easier to do this quickly.
And I found some of that, Kurt, ripping older CDs and having things pulled. You can tell me where the data source is, but you're right.
Great stuff. Yeah, the Grace Note database.
Sometimes it's Allman Brothers, sometimes the Allman Brothers. Sometimes I'm trying to think of an example and I can't, but if there's an and, sometimes it'll be A and D, sometimes it'll be ampersand, and then things don't sort right, or your smart playlists don't work right. So, but I did not
know. 2 entries for an artist name. And I mentioned in the book, and I've always mentioned when I'm writing about tagging classical music, to make sure that you choose the way you want your composers' names to appear. So you can't have Johann Sebastian Bach and Bach, Johann Sebastian, and J.S. Bach and Bach, J.S., because that just confuses everything. So you have to determine what your strategy is and normalize everything in order to not have a real mess in your library.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
In terms of new features, which aren't just interface, you may remember a while ago that Apple added love ratings, that little heart icon that makes you flutter when you hear a song and you click it and it's like, oh, I love this song. It's just wonderful. And, we long had star ratings since maybe iTunes 1 had star ratings, in fact. And Apple removed the star ratings for a while in iOS, and then they brought them back in 10.2 or something like that. So you've got 2 sets of ratings. You had star ratings, and before you had love ratings. And love ratings were simply, I've clicked this heart or I've not clicked it, right? So it was, I love it, and I don't care, or I haven't decided. So they added another rating, which is called dislike. And unfortunately, the design of this isn't ideal. The dislike rating is mainly for the Apple Music recommendation algorithm. So you say, I don't like this when you see something in For You, so Apple doesn't recommend more like that. Unfortunately, you can't see the dislike ratings in the iTunes interface, and you can't the love and the dislike are opposites, but while there's a love column, there's not a dislike column. It's a little bit weird. Again, it's useful for Apple Music. Previously, it was, I don't want to see this anymore, or something like that. So they've made it more clear. Dislike, I don't like it. I don't like it. I'm going to do this live here. I'm going to go to iTunes and For You, and I'm going to see the kind of stuff that they've put up for me, which is like, no matter how many times I tell Apple Music I don't like stuff, they put stuff up here that I don't like. James Blake. I mean, sorry. There are people in the world who like James Blake, not me. So I'm seeing things immediately when I look here. Jay Giles Band. That makes sense because I like a lot of 70s music, but I've never liked Jay Giles Band. So that's the kind of thing when I'm going to click right now, I'm going to click dislike. And Apple Music is going to try and remember this. It often takes a while for this to have any sort of effect, but it slowly hones the Apple Music recommendations.
I got to take us on a side trip for just a second. How do you feel about the concept of maybe not disliking anything, of liking everything that you like, but never voting something down? Does that improve the results?
No, it doesn't. See, that's what it was before. So you have to remember that there are 2 reasons why you see things on Apple Music in their recommendations. One is that you've bought music, you've played music by a certain artist, a certain type of music or whatever. But the second is because the record labels are promoting it. This isn't just, this isn't all random. There's payola going on here. Although the word payola, it's not the same as bribery. It's just, when you go in a supermarket, how do you think those Rice Krispies get on the end cap there? It's because Kellogg's paid a lot of money for it. It's similar. So you do need the dislike because you're going to see a lot of things you don't like. I don't care for rap music. Nothing wrong with people who like it, but I don't care for it. Apple is really pushing rap and hip hop very, very hard. And they keep showing me rap and hip hop music. All these artists that they're promoting that are doing the Apple exclusives. I don't want to see them. I really don't. So I think it's kind of necessary to do the dislike. Otherwise, they're going to assume that you like everything. Now it's kind of surprising. I'm going to go back here to iTunes and look what they're recommending. I guess a lot of this has to do with what I listen to, but the only things I really see are rock and classical and electronic music and ambient and jazz, and some blues. I don't see any world music. I like reggae. I listen to Indian music sometimes. And I think what happens is among all the genres in Apple Music and the iTunes Store, they really ignore a lot of them. Now, maybe if I listen to a lot of Indian music for a week, I might get some recommendations. I'm not sure. But my partner, with whom this is a plug, by the way, with whom I record a podcast called The Next Track, my partner Doug Adams has told me many times he just thinks that it just can't handle the eclectic nature of my library. It's very possible. One thing that's interesting is it very rarely recommends that I listen to the Grateful Dead, and got a Dead T-shirt on here. You can't see behind the microphone. I listen to a lot of Grateful Dead, but so there's one more complication. I'm looking on my iMac, and this library does not have iCloud Music Library turned on. And we talked about this 2 years ago with iTunes 11, how it totally destroyed my library, and I simply don't trust it. So what I do is I have a test library on my MacBook where I've got a lot of stuff from iTunes Music Library, from iCloud Music Library, and I can listen to my Apple Music on my iMac, but it doesn't mess up my library. It doesn't mix my tracks with Apple Music tracks. So in an ideal world, a normal library where everything's mixed, it might be a little bit more precise in terms of recommendations.
You mentioned classical, and especially tagging, and I know that's a passion of yours. It is not of mine. So again, I have to turn to you and say, how has the whole classical music tagging management thing improved or gone downhill?
So they've added a new feature with iTunes 12. I guess it was iTunes 12.0. There is now a set of what are called work and movement tags. So if you select a group of tracks and you press Command-I, you get the info window. And the first tag you see for individual tracks is song, and the first tag you see for multiple tracks is artist. Now, if you select, I'm going to do this live so I can explain exactly how it works. If you select here, I'm going to select this album here. Right. So there's a checkbox at the top when you select multiple tracks, and it says use work and movement. And when you do that, the info window changes and it displays three tags: work with a field, an empty field; movement, X of X, so like 1 of 4 or 2 of 4, etc., and name, which would be the name of the movement. When you do this, you can enter, and just take an example, Beethoven's Third Symphony has 4 movements, and you can enter the name of the symphony, you can enter the name of each movement, the precise name of the movement, and the number. Now, this has a couple of effects. One is that it groups these tracks together, and it makes it more coherent. And when you're looking at the tags, you can see a little bit better what it is. When it displays the name of a track in the iTunes library, it makes what I call a composite tag of this different information. But the other thing is that in some views, you'll see the name of the work and then indented 1 movement whatever, 2 movement whatever, etc. And you see this in iTunes and on iOS devices. So this is a real big improvement. Now, unfortunately, it's a lot of work to change a large classical library to use these tags. There's no easy way to do this. In my book, I mention a couple of Apple scripts that Doug Adams made, which helps to do this. So it'll copy the song name and put it in the movement track, because otherwise you'd have to do it manually. It'll number the movements, etc. So this is really good progress as far as classical music is concerned, and I'm very happy that Apple did make this choice, because what are we, the 3% of iTunes use? I mean, classical music has roughly a 5% market share, depending on where in the world. I'm guessing that a large share of that is what we call classical crossover. So Andrea Bocelli, things that are sort of classical, or the piano guys, this sort of pop classical stuff. And I think true classical music fans, listeners, collectors, maybe is 2% of people. So it's good that Apple's paying attention to that.
Today's edition of MacVoices is brought to you by Blue Apron. You can cook something new and interesting tonight when you visit blueapron.com/MacVoices. They provide the ingredients and recipes. You have the satisfaction of preparing and enjoying it. Blue Apron is a better way to cook. When I say you can cook something new and interesting tonight, I really mean it. Blue Apron's ingredients are what's new, because they're going to introduce you to things I'm betting you never had before. Ingredients I'm guessing you will love. Ingredients like miso, kale, gailan, barramundi, quinona, and bok choy. What makes it interesting is that those ingredients, and some you already know and love, get combined into brand new dishes that you're also going to love. Like hoisin chicken steam buns, paprika and fennel spiced salmon, burgers and red cabbage slaw, cheesy chicken and black bean enchiladas. I could go on, but I'm starting to get hungry. Blue Apron sends you these and many more terrific recipes. To make it even better, they also send you the ingredients themselves, in just the right amounts, so you can prepare the recipes perfectly. No running to the grocery store to get the ingredients you don't have, because you get everything automatically from Blue Apron. Besides, who knows where they keep the hoisin in the supermarket? Just because you prepare and eat the meals doesn't mean the experience is gone forever. When you find something you particularly like, there's nothing to stop you from going to the store, buying the ingredients, and remaking the dish yourself from scratch. Because actually, you've already made it from scratch with Blue Apron. While you're enjoying all this good food and the great experience of preparing it with your family, you can feel good knowing that Blue Apron has established partnerships with over 150 local farmers, fisheries, and ranchers across the U.S. Their seafood is sourced sustainably under standards developed with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch. Their beef, chicken, and pork come from responsibly raised animals, and the produce is sourced from farms that practice regenerative farming. So, the next Blue Apron meal you enjoy certainly won't be your last. I want you to try Blue Apron and have as much fun and good food as I'm enjoying by visiting blueapron.com/MacVoices. When you do, you will get 3 meals shipped to you for free. That means there's no risk. Get that big Blue Apron box delivered right to your door, free, and start a whole new way of cooking and eating. That's blueapron.com/MacVoices. Blue Apron truly is a better way to cook. Thanks to Blue Apron for their support of MacVoices. Do you feel like there are more improvements that should be made, I'm going to say should be made, and then I'll say that you would want to see made as a real classic music enthusiast?
I would like to see it. I would like to see a menu command that says apply work and movement tags. So instead of Doug's Apple scripts, iTunes would do that. It would go dig out each tag from the file and it would apply it in the right place. I think that would be a lot easier for most users who don't know about AppleScript and get frustrated when they see this, because one of the problems is when you make this change, you don't see the tags anymore, and so you've got to remember them or check a CD or check a list someplace to make them manually. It's a bit of it's a finicky operation to do this, so it would be nice if they could do this automatically. Aside from that, I think, we've always sort of adapted to the album song model for classical music. I'm not sure at this point it's really worth changing with a large library, because, as I said, it would take a long time. But it is good because you'll see this in the iTunes store and in Apple Music more and more. Classical albums show the name of the work followed by the movements, whereas if you look at some older albums that haven't been updated, you just see a list of songs, because that's the way they're treated. It's a slow process, but it's good. They've done some good work there.
Good. And this is certainly I want to put in a couple plugs. I want to put in a plug for Doug's scripts, because this will help you in so many ways if you are, and you don't even have to be fanatic about it. Just if you have something you want to accomplish with iTunes, Doug probably has a script for it. I know I use a number of them on a regular basis, some almost on a daily basis. So go and check those out. Spend a little time browsing, maybe looking for things you want to do. But also, Kirk, you mentioned The Next Track, and it remains one of my favorite podcasts. I still consider it a new podcast.
Well, we just released episode 40, so we're still not a year old. We've got 3 more months to be a year old.
Yeah, but I like it. You tag it as, how do you say it? For people who listen to music today.
We talk about how people listen to music today.
Yeah. And I really I like it because you hit so many different things without necessarily advocating this type of music or that type of music. You talk about some of the engineering, you talk about production, you talk about organization. Just across the board, it really is about listening to music, and it's a terrific idea, and you guys do just a great job of it.
Thanks. I appreciate that. When we started the podcast, what we wanted to do was link up our interests in music as being music fans in technology as people who use audio hardware with computers, obviously, because we both work around iTunes. So those are the sort of three main themes. And as you said, we've had a Grammy-nominated mastering engineer. We've had someone talking about Robert Johnson's blues, someone talking about the history of the Grateful Dead. In the episode I just published, which people can listen to, when do you publish this podcast here? Tomorrow? Saturday?
Probably it'll go out early next week.
Right. So the latest episode is an interview with David Sachs, who wrote an interesting book called The Revenge of Analog. And he discusses how people are rediscovering vinyl records, as well as some other analog things like notebooks and board games and film and things like that. And the next episode we're recording next week, we're going to talk about equalizers. The kind of equalizers that people had in stereo systems in the 70s and 80s, and now the kind that are digital and all that. So we do want to cover as many topics as possible, because these are all questions that we've all had as music listeners at one time or another. And if you're curious about music, you might want to know the history of Robert Johnson and the blues. I mean, it was a really interesting podcast to understand that what we think we know about the blues is very different than what really happened. It's at thenexttrack.com. You can find us on iTunes. We've got a whole bunch of interesting guests coming up in the weeks to come.
Great. I always enjoy it. Now you have me looking forward to the next couple episodes, because now I have a preview.
Yep.
So, Kirk, at the end of the day, anything that you feel like has radically changed in this version of iTunes, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you feel like iTunes is just slowly improving and refining and actually getting better.
I think. Yeah, the 12.5 is a lot of refinements, a lot of rejiggering, reorganization, interface refinements, and all that. There is another big new feature which is worth mentioning. It's custom lyrics, and it's lyrics that display if you have an Apple Music subscription. So when you're listening in iTunes, there's a little button to the right of the iTunes LCD. That's the thing in the center of the toolbar that shows like the track name and the artist. And the button to the right is the Up Next button. And if you click that, you can see what's in your listening queue. It could be the rest of the album you're listening to or the playlist, but there's another tab called lyrics that can display lyrics. Now, it doesn't display lyrics for everything. You have to have an Apple Music subscription, or you've entered lyrics manually for your songs, which you've been able to do for a long time. But if you are listening to something and you're in front of your computer and you want the lyrics, it's a nice thing to have rather than checking on the web. At the same time, this is available in iTunes 10. You can also see lyrics on an iPhone or an iPad.
Every time we talk, I end up feeling kind of like an iTunes slacker, because I don't know about and don't use so many of these features. And then when I hear about them, it's like, that would be kind of useful, because there are times all of us wonder about the lyrics, because vocalists sometimes don't have the best pronunciation.
Yeah.
So I got to go back and explore this again. So.
It's one of those apps that, again, there are hundreds of discrete features, and no one other than me and maybe Doug Adams, who writes Apple scripts, really needs to know about all of these, right? And what I find is, so I get lots of questions. I write the Ask the iTunes Guy column on Macworld, and I get lots of questions every week. And a lot of times the answers are really simple. Well, you just go here and you just do this. And obviously I know about it because I know iTunes backwards and forwards, but I understand that most people don't know it. They wouldn't know where to look. They wouldn't even know what a certain feature might be called to know how to look for it. And if you're a serious music fan and iTunes user, now I switch into marketing mode, you owe it to yourself to buy my book, because you'll be able to browse through it and discover a plethora of features you don't know about. And when you do have a question, you'll be able to go back and use it as a reference, because the book is organized in very simple chapters like play, stream, cloud, share, tag, view. I mean, we did really good because they're all one word. They're all verbs, except we had a problem. Previously, podcasts were split in a couple of chapters, and we wanted to group them together. So that chapter is called podcasts. But all the other ones are verbs, except for podcast. And we were really annoyed about it. You know how Tonya Angst is, my editor, about things like that. Everything has to be just exactly right. We actually fretted about this if we could figure out another way to do it, but we decided to have the one noun chapter in the book.
Well, if you had just taken off the S, then you could just say podcast,
No, but then that would mean that you're producing podcasts.
Okay, I was going for the verb thing, but you're right.
Here
you're
it's
right.
for listening to podcasts.
You're right.
Oh, we dug this. We went into rabbit holes about this.
You don't mess with the editor. You don't mess with Tanya.
Well, no, we both wanted to maintain, because early on we agreed. I don't know if it was my idea or hers, that the one-word chapter title, just a verb, is just the best way. You scan the table of contents and immediately you see what you're looking for. And there's one exception, is the last chapter, which is back up. Now, that's what's called a phrasal verb, and I consider that to be a single lexical unit, right? So even though it's two words, it counts as one word conceptually. But then podcast came in and we had to, nounify it. Or substantify it would be the more correct linguistic term. I studied linguistics in another life.
Is nounify a word?
No.
Okay.
But if you agree, we can make it one.
Well,
that's how language works.
Yeah, it conveys the message. I didn't know that was going to be a new one. Okay.
A noun is also called a substantive. So you could, I would assume the word is substantify, because, in English word I actually wrote a thing about English word formation. You can very often take a noun and make it a verb, take a verb and make it a noun. So anyway, that's not the topic of the podcast.
Kirk and I will be launching the Grammatical Voices podcast very soon.
That's a good idea. Grammatical Voices. I like that.
Just shoot me now.
But, first of all, there's probably a podcast like that. And second of all, if we made a podcast like that, we'd get rich.
Yes.
Because so many people are interested in that.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Well, I did not consider before the grammar thing, I did not consider what you were doing marketing, because I think it is a good point that this is a book that's very approachable. It's very easy to drill down, but I guarantee you will find features and you will use iTunes in ways that you never knew you could. Maybe you didn't necessarily need to, but now that you know you can, you might. And I love that. I love that. Kurt, how is the pricing and the upgrades being handled for this?
It's $15, and you get $5 discount if you're a previous purchaser of the iTunes 12 version.
Great.
And I don't know if they go back to, if you have the iTunes 11 version, if there's upgrade pricing. I'm sorry. You can check the Take Control Books website and find out more about that. Okay.
And of course, as Kirk just said, takecontrolbooks.com is where you're going to find this. Folks, go get it. I think you will. If you use iTunes at all, again, you're going to. I just learned some things today, so I promise you will learn some things. Kirk, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. We'll do it again when the next revision comes out, or I'm sure before that.
I think before that. There will be another book before that.
Great.
Thanks, Chuck, for having me again.
It's always fun. Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Mac Voices. Please go and check out Take Control of iTunes, the second edition. Let us know what you think about some of this in our new Facebook group. We'd love to have you there. It's the Mac Voices Facebook group, and that's going to be the place where we're going to be discussing tech and Apple tech, and just not politics. That's the only prohibited topic.
Good idea.
Until the next time, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes, links to subscribe, and to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, Facebook, YouTube, Vimeo, SoundCloud, the Mac Voices blog, the Mac Voices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter, and on Mac Voices magazine, free on Flipboard that helps you do more with your Apple tech. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.